Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. So today, we're tackling a topic that, honestly, often feels like a dense biological maze when you're first looking at it. But I promise you, it's actually an amazingly fascinating and totally relatable journey. We're going to explore neural control and coordination. We're talking about the literal electrical wiring inside your own body that makes you, well, you. Okay, let's dive right into this.
Stop and think about this for just a second. How are you physically able to hear my voice, understand these concepts, and maybe even jot down some notes on this explainer at this exact moment? It is not magic, I promise. It's millions of microscopic signals firing across your body in just perfect harmony. And today, we're going to map out exactly how that happens. Here's our game plan for today. We'll start with a nervous system overview, look at the anatomy of a neuron, figure out the generation of nerve impulses, check out synapses and signal transfer, and finally wrap up with the human brain.
All right, Section 1, the nervous system overview. Let's map out your body's electrical grid. You can basically think of your nervous system in two massive chunks. First, you've got the central nervous system, or CNS. That's just your brain and your spinal cord, the absolute ultimate command center. Then, everything else is your peripheral nervous system, or PNS. The PNS is totally made up of fibers, just carrying signals back and forth. You have afferent, or sensory fibers that bring signals into the brain, like, when you accidentally touch a super hot coffee mug. And then you have efferent, or motor fibers, that carry signals away from the brain, screaming at your hand to drop the mug. Oh, and a really crucial, often overlooked part of the PNS is the visceral nervous system. That's a dedicated system carrying signals straight from your CNS to your internal visceral organs.
Moving right along to Section 2, Anatomy of a Neuron.
Okay, so let's meet the actual physical wire, the neuron. Signals enter through these branch-like structures called dendrites, and then they move straight into the cell body. Now, inside that cell body, you'll find these things called Nissl granules, which are actually just made up of rough endoplasmic reticulum and ribosomes. From there, the signal travels down this long tail, which we call the axon. Notice those little bead-like things on the axon? Those are Schwann cells, and their job is to secrete a protective, fatty layer called the myelin shield. But it's not a solid coating. There are tiny bare gaps between those myelin sheets known as the nodes of Ranvier. Finally, the signal reaches the very end of the line, the synaptic knobs, which are just packed with chemical messengers called neurotransmitters.
Now, obviously, not all neurons look exactly alike. In biology, structure completely dictates function. For instance, if a neuron just has one axon and zero dendrites, it's a unipolar neuron, and we mostly see those back in our embryonic stage. Bipolar neurons have exactly one axon and one dendrite, which makes them perfectly suited for the retina of your eye. Then you have multipolar neurons, featuring one axon and multiple dendrites. These are the heavy lifters found in your brain's cerebral cortex. And hey, we even have apolar neurons, which are literally just cell bodies with no axons at all, though you'll only find those in simple organisms like the hydra. It's just a beautiful example of how our body custom builds specific wires for highly specific tasks. Let's jump into Section 3, Generation of Nerve Impulses. So we've seen the wire itself, but how does electricity actually flow through it? A lot of people get stuck here, but the exact math of a nerve impulse is completely, beautifully logical. Here's the chronological story of a signal. At rest, the inside of a neuron is negative compared to the outside. It just sits there at a resting potential of negative 70 millivolts. But when a strong enough signal hits, boom, sodium channels open up. Positively charged sodium rushes in, and that spikes the internal voltage up to positive 30 millivolts. We call this depolarization. Now, obviously, the neuron needs to reset itself eventually. So potassium channels open up next, and potassium rushes out. The problem, it overcorrects. The voltage drops all the way down to negative 90 millivolts, and that state right there is called hyperpolarization. Okay, so we're stuck at this negative 90 millivolt overcorrection. How do we fix that and get back to our starting point? Enter our biological hero, the ATP pump. The absolutely crucial thing to know here is that this pump uses cellular energy, ATP, to actively throw 3 sodium ions back out while simultaneously pulling 2 potassium ions back in. Doing this perfectly balances the charges out again, restoring the neuron to its happy resting state of negative 70 millivolts. Now it's completely ready for the next signal. Remember that fatty myelin sheath we talked about, coating the axon? Well, if a neuron has that, it gets a massive speed upgrade. Instead of that voltage wave traveling slowly and continuously down the entire length of the wire, the electrical impulse literally skips. It jumps from bare gap to bare gap, right across those nodes of Ranvier. This leaping process is called saltatory conduction, and it makes the signal significantly faster and incredibly efficient.
All right, section 4, synapses and signal transfer.
Okay, so we know how a signal moves down one single wire, but what happens when it runs out of road? How does it cross the physical gap to get to the next wire? Well, that gap between neurons is called a synapse, and your body actually has two options here. First, electrical synapses. These are actually pretty rare in our bodies. The neurons are physically connected by these tiny things called gap junctions, making the transfer hyper fast. But way more common are chemical synapses. Here, there is a literal physical empty space called the synaptic cleft. Since electricity can't just jump through empty space, the system has to rely on a slightly slower biological handoff using chemicals. And here is exactly how that chemical handoff works step by step. When the electrical signal finally hits the very end of that first neuron, it forces calcium channels to open up. Calcium rushes in and binds to these tiny sacs called synaptic vesicles. Think of this calcium like a trigger. It causes those vesicles to just dump their neurotransmitters, stuff like acetylcholine or dopamine, straight into the gap through a process called exocytosis. Those chemicals float across the cleft, they bind to receptors on the next neuron, and boom, the electrical signal fires up and starts all over again on the other side. And finally, section 5, the human brain. So we followed the signal all the way from the touch of a hot mug, up the wiring, across the synapses, and we finally arrived at the ultimate destination. But before we look at the brain itself, we really need to look at its armor. Your brain is protected by 3 layers of membranes called the cranial meninges. From the outside going in, right under your skull bone, you have the really tough dura mater. Right beneath that is the middle layer called the arachnoid, and then intimately hugging the actual brain tissue itself is the pia mater. And what's super vital to note here is that your protective cerebrospinal fluid flows completely safely in the space right beneath that middle arachnoid layer. Inside the armor, the brain is divided into 3 main sections. Let's start with the massive forebrain. This houses the cerebrum, which is the largest, wrinkliest part of your brain, and it's split into 2 hemispheres connected by this bridge of fibers called the corpus callosum. The forebrain also holds the limbic system, which includes your hippocampus for memory and your amygdala for emotions, like anger and fear. Lastly, it holds the diencephalon. That's where you'll find the thalamus, which acts like a giant relay station, and the hypothalamus, which is literally the boss of your vital urges. We're talking hunger, thirst, and keeping your body temperature regulated. Now, you've probably heard people say something like, "Oh, use your gray matter," when they want you to think hard. Well, in the cerebrum, the outer layer, the cortex, is actually literally gray. Why? Because it is incredibly densely packed with neuron cell bodies. The inner layer, on the other hand, is white matter, and it gets that color from millions of fatty, myelinated axons. So next time you see someone scratching their head trying to remember something, you can appreciate that they are literally trying to stimulate that dense outer layer of gray cell bodies. Moving down from the forebrain, we hit a very small but absolutely critical section, the midbrain. Right here, we find the corpora quadrigemina. These are 4 very distinct little swellings located exclusively on the dorsal or the back side of the midbrain. What do? They handle your visual and auditory reflexes. Like when you hear a loud bang and your head automatically snaps towards the sound, that's them. Just make sure you don't confuse the corpora quadrigemina with the corpus callosum we mentioned earlier. Totally different things. We conclude our little anatomical tour at the base of the skull with the hindbrain. The hindbrain features 3 major players. First, the pons. It acts as a bridge interconnecting different brain regions, and it heavily regulates your respiration. Second is the cerebellum. That's the highly folded, second largest part of the whole brain. Think of it as your body's gyroscope. It manages your balance and literally keeps you walking in a straight line. Finally, there's the medulla oblongata, which connects right into your spinal cord. This is the autopilot for your deepest involuntary reflexes. It controls your breathing rate, your heart rate, and yep, even your vomiting reflex. Real quick before we wrap up, let's clear up a super common misconception about the brainstem. A lot of students assume it's just another word for the hindbrain. It's not. The brainstem is actually formed by the midbrain, plus the pons, plus the medulla. It's the literal stalk that connects your higher brain to the rest of your body. As we zoom out and look at the big picture of neural control, it's fun to think about this. People love to say you have to choose whether to listen to your heart or your head. But in the incredibly fascinating world of biology, your brain is the ultimate command center, orchestrating every single system we've just talked about. There's no separation. It is all beautifully electrically coordinated by your nervous system. Just take a second to appreciate what your body accomplished in the last 10 minutes. You've fired millions of neurons, pumped countless sodium and potassium ions back and forth, and released an absolute tidal wave of neurotransmitters, literally just to watch, process, and understand this explainer. You're walking, talking, thinking electricity. So, with that incredible biological supercomputer sitting right inside your skull, what fascinating topic will your brain choose to master next? Keep learning, keep firing those neurons, and I will catch you in the next explainer.